Good morning, beautiful people. Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Fayetteville. My name is Stephanie Bentley, and I'm your worship associate this morning. I'm also on the board, and I might be your next president, I'm not sure, pending the congregational meeting. I'm so glad to be here with you guys today. Unitarian Universalism is a religious tradition that values freedom in religious thought and journey. We uphold the unity of our interconnections, connections to each other, to all of life, and to the precious universe of which we are a part. We affirm the universality of love and hope as we journey together in community, and we welcome you, whoever you are at this moment, and wherever you are in your spiritual journey. For those of you joining us online, welcome. If you're new, please check out our website, uufayetteville.org, for more information. For those of you visiting us for the first time in person, you will find a visitor information card on the seat back in front of you. We would love for you to fill one out so we can get you on the email list and keep you informed of our events. Later in our service, we will have a time where you're invited to come forward and drop a stone symbolizing your joy or concern into our bowl of water. If you have a joy or concern you would like to share, we invite you to fill out one of the yellow cards you will find on the seat back in front of you. Ta-da! There is a place on there to indicate if you want your joy or concern shared aloud or if you want it to be confidential and shared only with leadership. If you fill out a yellow card, you can bring that forward at that time. If you're online, you can write your joys or concerns in the comments there at that time. Please note these comments will be public. If you have a need for hearing assistance, our amazing AV Tech David can help you with that. And kids are always welcome in our service, but there is a staff nursery available downstairs if you would prefer. Please remember to silence your cell phones as we enter into our service. And today's speaker is the amazing Jeff Nash. He is one of us, so we all know how amazing he is. And I believe he taught at the University of UALR and a few other places. And we're just so glad to hear from him today on the topic of capitalism. Very timely. Thank you.
Okay, the reading today is from William Thomas, who was an 18th century Irish political economist. The direct operation of wealth is chiefly to afford the means of more extensive pleasures of the senses. It is only indirectly that it operates to increase our moral and intellectual pleasures. And when unequally distributed in very large masses, it tends to eradicate almost entirely these higher moral and intellectual pleasures. That was written in 1824 at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in England and Ireland and all across, certainly in Germany as well. I'll read you the title of his book, and you can think about titles today. The title of his book, from which this quote came, is An Inquiry into the Principles of the Distribution of Wealth Most Conducive to Human Happiness, applied to the newly proposed system of voluntary equality of wealth.
Please join Maple and I as we say our UU words to light our chalice. Love is the spirit of this community, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge and truth, and to love one another. Thus do we covenant together.
Good morning. So our first hymn, our opening hymn today is to Mercy, Pity, Peace, and Love. This is very new, so we're going to play through it all the way first, so you have a chance to hear it. Please rise as you're willing and able as we sing our hymn. Thank you. You may be seated.
Good morning. My name's Abby Horsager, and I'm delighted that I get to share with you the story for all ages. Click, clack, moo, cows that type. This is by Doreen Cronin and pictures by Betsy Lumen. Farmer Brown has a problem. His cows like to type. All day long he hears click, clack, moo, click, clack, moo, clickety, clack, moo. At first he couldn't believe his ears. Cows that type? Impossible. Click, clack, moo, click, clack, moo, clickety, clack, moo. Then he couldn't believe his eyes. Dear Farmer Brown, the barn is very cold at night. We'd like some electric blankets. Sincerely, the cows. It was bad enough the cows had found the old typewriter in the barn. Now they wanted electric blankets? No way, said Farmer Brown. No electric blankets. So the cows went on strike. They left a note on the barn door. Sorry, we're closed. No milk today. No milk today, cried the farmer. In the background, he heard the cows busy at work. Click, clack, moo, click, clack, moo, clickety, clack, moo. The next day, he got another note. Dear Farmer Brown, the hens are cold too. They'd like electric blankets. Sincerely, the cows. The cows were growing impatient with the farmer. They left a new note on the door. Closed. No milk, no eggs. No eggs? Cried Farmer Brown. In the background, he heard them. Click, clack, moo, click, clack, moo, clickety, clack, moo. Cows that type, hens on strike. Who heard of such a thing? How can I run a farm with no milk and no eggs? Farmer Brown was furious. Farmer Brown got out his own typewriter. Dear cows and hens, there will be no electric blankets. You are cows and hens. I demand milk and eggs. Sincerely, Farmer Brown. Duck was a neutral party, so he brought the ultimatum to the cows. The cows held an emergency meeting. All the animals gathered around the barn to snoop, but none of them could understand moo. All night long, Farmer Brown waited for an answer. Duck knocked on the door early the next morning. He handed Farmer Brown a note. Dear Farmer Brown, we will exchange our typewriter for electric blankets. Leave them outside the barn door and we will send Duck over with the typewriter. Sincerely, the cows. Farmer Brown decided this was a good deal. He left the blankets next to the barn door and waited for Duck to come with the typewriter. The next morning he got a note. Dear Farmer Brown, the pond is quite boring. We'd like a diving board. Sincerely, the ducks. Click, clack, quack, click, clack, quack, clickety, clack, quack. Yeah.
Love it. Thank you, Abby. As a community of people who care about each other, we share our various joys and concerns. We invite you to share your ups and downs as you desire. You can come to the front and drop a stone for any joy or concern, shared or confidential, expressed or held in your heart. As you drop your stone, may you experience the spreading of love and support. If you filled out a card, you can bring it to me, this one. On the card, indicate whether your comment is confidential or to be shared. If you need to stay where you are, feel free to raise the card so someone can get it and bring it up for you. If you're attending virtually, you can write your joys and concerns in the comments at this time. Okay. You may come forward. Thank you. Okay. Do we have any joys or concerns on Facebook, David?
Yeah.
Let's have a moment of silence as we hold all these joys and concerns in our hearts. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Joanna Person-Michener, and I'm very grateful to be able to share with you all today about my journey and why this fellowship means so much to Sam and me. And I want to thank Edith and the stewardship team for the vital work that they do for our fellowship. It's so important. So when I was a child growing up, part of my childhood in Northern California, I often heard my mother's parents talk about this mysterious and wonderful place called the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Berkeley. I never set foot in the place, but I heard them talk about it. They shared about how they taught religious education there and how UUism really aligned and embodied their values and their beliefs, but they were no longer practicing, if you will, with a UU at that time. But they were some of the kindest and most well-rounded, socially and environmentally conscious people that I ever knew. Lucky me, right? And I loved them very much. Y'all can tell, right? And they also identified as agnostic, and they talked about that. And so during that time of my childhood, I grew up loving them and admiring them for all the good things that they were doing in the community for people and for planet. You know, my grandmother loved whales, and she took me to the Marine Center and talked to me about the importance of protecting our environment at a very early age. When I was 9 years old, my father and his parents moved us from the Bay Area to a small town in southwest Arkansas. And that was an area that my paternal grandmother had grown up in, but they hadn't lived there for 30 years. And it was a big change. Thank y'all for understanding. Before long, the kids at school were telling me that I was going to hell because I wasn't saved or going to church, and I didn't even know what hell was. But I thought I better go find out. So I started attending a local missionary Baptist church there, and by the time I was 10, I was saved and baptized. For the next 17, I went by myself. My family didn't go, but they would drop me off, you know. And I felt like that's what I had to do to have friends, so I went. For the next 17 years, I was a Christian, and I even felt that I had a calling to be an international missionary. I love the idea of having a relationship with the creator of the universe and the unconditional love part of the Jesus story. But over time, I found myself in deep conflict, cognitive dissonance, if you will, with some of the teachings of the faith as they were taught to me or as I understood them at the time. My values of equality and compassion, curiosity, and care for the earth were more aligned with my maternal grandparents' UU way of life. When I had finally let go of the last vestiges of the Christian worldview as the only way, which was not too incidentally after watching the movie Pearl Harbor. It's just transformative. I needed a long break from organized religion. Still, in the back of my mind, all those years I thought, if I ever return to a spiritual community, it will be a UU. Many years passed. I worked in healthcare oversight. I traveled. I got married. Almost all of my family members died of various ailments. I changed careers. I volunteered with nonprofits that aligned with my values. I got divorced. I pursued a master's in counseling and a PhD in environmental dynamics. And the very best thing about my life happened, which was because I became Sam's mom. When Sam went to preschool, the other kids started asking him where he went to church, and I knew what we had to do. I wanted him to grow up in a spiritual community grounded in love and acceptance and justice. So we came here to the UUFF, and we joined in 2018. And from the start, you welcomed us with open arms and open hearts. Leanda, Stephanie, Reverend Jim at the time, Jean, Fawn, Renee, and Carol were among some of the first to help us feel deeply seen and cared for. Before long, I was helping in YRE with Leanda, and Sam and I began to make real friends. As someone who's just kind of a weirdo, Thank you. I'm amazed and grateful to have found in all of you a community that gives Sam and I acceptance and a real sense of belonging. Didn't always have that. Y'all can relate, I know. The fellowship for us has become that sticky church that Jean talks about, the kind of place where you stay not because of programs or dogma, but because you have real friends. I see a lot of nods. The community has become our spiritual home, and for that I am just immensely and endlessly grateful. Thank you. I'm not done. Okay. I'm also really inspired to be a part of a community that puts our values and our principles into action with each other and in Fayetteville and Northwest Arkansas and even beyond. And I'm thankful for the tremendous spiritual leadership of Reverend Renee. I know she's not here today, but she's here in spirit, whose vision and heart inspires us to grow in our giving and in tangible ways, too, that we work to make the world more just, like through Action Sundays. I'm inspired by our board of directors. They strive to nurture the heart of our fellowship, never losing sight of our vision and mission, while still stewarding our resources so that we can continue our work with each other and our community, our broader community. This is not a small feat. It takes dedication, creativity, intellect, resourcefulness, and a sense of humor. And I'm grateful to our Chalice team who create services that foster emotional resilience, spiritual growth, and intellectual honesty, while balancing our diverse wants and needs, y'all. We've got some diverse wants and needs. I love and appreciate our administrative team who helps us communicate, stay in the know, and manage the day-to-day and prevent catastrophes. Our programs and committees create a working tapestry of community resilience through our religious education programs, justice team, collaborating with others on climate, immigrant, and housing rights, all the way to our welcoming congregations committee with their incredibly important work that they do to keep us inclusive for everyone, because love is love. And I'm also grateful for the support of our Green Sanctuary Initiative. There's a table about it today if y'all want to learn a little more about it, as well as our grounds crews supporting native plants and the web of life, keeping our pagan traditions and our connection to the living earth alive. I'm grateful for our ongoing coffee hour, allowing us to visit on a weekly basis, as well as covenant groups. Also for our collaborations in the community with New Beginnings and Seven Hills, Mayday, the Interfaith Climate Alliance, Citizens Climate Lobby, and many more. I'm grateful for our new leaders who are stepping up into roles like the care team, membership, and fostering our connections through family and community feasting, as well as X to Z. And I'm very grateful that, as with all genuine human communities, we have something completely normal, albeit often challenging, and that's conflict. It's a normal part of human relationships when we're being real with each other. But we're able to work through it and grow from it with time and respectful approaches. That's precious. And of course, I'm exceedingly grateful for our fearless, harmonious, genuine, kind, empathetic, and truly admirable president, Kate Kowalski, who has given 2 years of dedicated service as president, clearly out of a deep love for our community. So, As we enter the season of gratitude and generosity, I just want to remind everyone that we're still having our pledge drive. And I heard it was officially the last day of something. but you know, the pledge drive never really ends, y'all. Your pledges make everything that we love about UU possible: our worship, our music, our social justice work, our RE programs, and just the simple gift of getting to be together possible. So just remember to fill out your membership form, even if you're already a member, so that we can keep an accurate count and continue to grow. There's some physical forms out in the foyer on the Green Sanctuary table, and you can also do this online. Fawn has sent out a link. 2 members, yes. Thank you for being the safe and kind, change-making community that you all are. You've made a home for Sam and me and for so many others who need exactly what this fellowship offers: love, love without condition, and belonging without exception. Thank you. Now I'm done. Okay. I'm supposed to stay up here and do the offering. So John Johnson and Edith Bradbury are coming forth to accept the offering. And I'm going to turn the page so I can read the script. This fellowship is the community of ourselves. Its energy and resources are our energy and resources. Its wealth is what we share. As we contribute to the life of the community, we affirm the life it brings to us. So this offering sustains us and strengthens us. And you can also give online too, if that's more convenient for you.
We could replay the children's book, and that's pretty much my message, but it fits nicely with what I want to talk about. What I'll talk about today is capitalism, a UU perspective. I mentioned this to a friend of ours the other day, and she said, well, that sounds interesting, but what's a UU? I thought, well, it's too long to spell out, right? So anyway. Okay. I thought I'd start with a little discussion about this. Some of you may be familiar with this. It's a mural by the Mexican muralist Delgado Rivera, and it was commissioned during the height of the Great Depression, when the idea that democratic capitalism could be sustained by honest market competition was under great question, because the Great Depression was going on. The Rockefellers were, in 1933, constructing the Rockefeller Center. And Nelson Rockefeller had run into some of the work of Rivera, and he liked it very much, and he commissioned him to do this mural in the balcony of the Rockefeller Center. And I don't know if you can see it very well, but it was almost completed when the Rockefeller family began to realize that this was a mural about the evils of capitalism and the good of socialism. And the issue came to a point when you can see over here there's a Lenin's picture is on the socialist side. And that got Nelson Rockefeller's attention. It was a big battle between the two, the artist and the money source. And Rivera came up with a solution, which I thought was kind of interesting. He said, okay, I'll put Abraham Lincoln's picture next to Lenin. The Rockefellers did not buy that. They fired Rivera. They stopped the construction. And a year later, they chiseled. Now, this thing was like 40 feet long. They chiseled the whole thing off the wall. Rivera went back to Mexico and recreated it in Mexico City. And if you're ever in Mexico City, you can see it, right? So I thought this was kind of an interesting way to talk about the tensions, that exist within capitalism. In London, this is a famous piece of, it's a graffiti actually, and it's about 20 to 40 feet off the ground in an alley. We were recently in London, and I didn't think to try to look this up, but there's a picture of it's about 30 feet up. It was done overnight, and it's called Woman Falling, and it symbolizes the catastrophe that's about to happen from consumerism. You see, she's desperately hanging on to her shopping bags as she goes towards the ground. Okay, so I also would like to talk about the suspicious attitudes that can be gleaned from our Christian tradition. You may remember, this is a scene from Jesus Christ Superstar, the temple scene, and you may remember that Jesus is the only point in the Bible where he expressed anger and was violent when he found money changers in the temple. And if you haven't seen this, you can YouTube it and see it. It's about 7 minutes long, and it's very, very dramatic. Jesus is knocking over machine guns and stomping out drug peddlers and all kinds of stuff like that. Okay, now, in the Old Testament, there are similar criticisms of what we now call capitalism. Deuteronomy, at the end of every 7 years, you shall grant a release of debts. Every creditor shall release what he has loaned to his neighbor. Now, it would be hard to imagine modern capitalism if we didn't have lending, right? And we'll be talking about that later. If you lend money to the poor among you, you shall not be like the moneylender to him. You shall not charge him interest. Leviticus, if any of your fellow Israelites become so poor that they sell themselves to you, they are to be released in the year of the Jubilee, which was every 50 years. You're supposed to reset stuff. The biblical implications for criticisms of capitalism seem to be debt forgiveness, mercy towards people who cannot repay, and systemic economic resets, which is, I think, an important point when we want to talk about this. Something built into the system so that periodically there are resets, right? In the case of forgiving your debts, in the case of starting all over in 50-year intervals. You may remember that Adam Smith is often given credit as the first modern capitalist, And it's important for me to point out that unlike modern economics, Adam Smith was very much interested in morals. And he firmly believed, that the unseen hand, the laissez-faire approach, was a moral approach, which, when given equal grounds of competition, would produce the unseen hand, which would rise everybody. It was a moral argument that he made, not strictly an economic argument. So there's this precedence even in the beginning. Now, what does this have to do with a UU perspective? Well, I got to thinking about that, and what I came up with is that there are at least two principles, and we could probably deal with more, that pertain to a criticism of capitalism, and especially pointing out the moral implications of how capitalism operates. First do the workings of economic affairs recognize the inherent worth and dignity of every person? That's one of our principles. Second, can we morally accept capitalist practices and consequences pertaining to justice and compassion? Another one of our principles. And then if we refer to the revised principles or the new, I don't think it's actually been adopted yet. We're still under the old principles, but we would be talking, obviously, about equity, justice, and generosity. So taking those principles and start looking at what's going on in capitalism, I want to start talking about the issue of debt. We've already seen that there's all kinds of ideas about the equal distribution of wealth, reading from William Thomas, who was an early feminist, and when he wrote, he's a precursor to Marx. They weren't called socialists, but today we would call them socialists. They were just critics of what they were seeing in capitalism. The first chart is a very important chart, and we hear lots of stuff about federal debt and the debt that we run on. And you might notice the little peaks. I don't know if we can. Oh yeah, okay. This is debt relative to GNP, and you can see. And what do they have in common, right? This is the proportion of, this is debt relative to GNP. The peaks, you probably can't read that, right? Okay, the first one is the Civil War. And you can see debt goes way up in the Civil War. World War I, debt goes way up. And this one, of course, is World War II, which until quite recently was our most expensive war, which we've still not paid off the debt for. But you can see this period, Vietnam, Iraq, and particularly Afghanistan, have accounted for trillions of dollars spent and not paid. So it goes to debt. Here's the debt over the long run. This is 1940 to 2029. It's a projection, and you can see that we're almost back to the same high we were in World War II. Now, what's important to recognize about that is that when we fought World War II, the Ford, General Motors, Standard Oil, all these big robber barons that had developed, in the period from the Civil War to World War I, were taken over by the government. So what used to be Ford Model Ts that were manufactured, at the Rosie River plant just north of Oakland, California, we're now doing Jeeps. And the idea of markets went away because we're fighting a war. And then we went into this other period where debt began to drop. We're going to talk about it in a minute. And then nationally, we have these debts that are continuing to grow. Now, why that's important, I want to kind of go through a little simple analysis to show what's going on and why I think we need to think morally about some of these issues. If you look at the data, the first line, the broader line is productivity. And economists measure productivity in lots of ways. Basically, it just means, how much are we producing and how much are we getting for it and how are they selling and all that sort of thing. The second line is wages. Now, you can see that from back almost, World War II especially, wages and productivity rose more or less together. So this meant that as people worked at their jobs, they made enough money to buy things. And of course, we know now that 70% of our economy is based on our consumption, right? And what began to happen in 1970 and through the 80s, and we know you guys can probably answer the question, what happened? Yeah, Reaganism, yeah, the rise of neoliberalism. And that money and profit then became the gap between productivity and wages equals profit. That's where profit can be. Now, the question is, how do you maintain? So here's a tension. You can make a lot of money by not paying workers what they need to participate in the economy. That's true. How do you sustain that tension over time? What's the solution to the tension? How do you keep it going? Credit cards. Exactly. Credit. The gap between productivity and consumption equals profit from the money that used to go to employees as wages, and instead they get credit that creates debt that has become that becomes a profit for banks. So it's a really interesting kind of trick that resolves a tension. Here's the result. Credit card debt alone in the first quarter of 2025 is $1.8 trillion. Automotive car debt, first quarter of 2025, $1.66 trillion. Mortgage debt, $12.94 trillion. So the total consumer debt is $18.39 trillion. The GNP in the same year is 30.9. So our debt is getting close to our GNP. It's still got a way to go, but it's moving in that direction. Now, what is a trillion? Very hard to imagine what a trillion is. I found this little illustration that helped me. If you go back 1 billion seconds counting on a calendar or on a clock, you would end up in 1987. If you went back 1 trillion seconds, you would end up in 30,000 BC. That's the difference between 1 billion and 1 trillion. And of course, it's money that you can almost, which can't imagine. If there's a case to be made that it's not really even money when it gets up to that point. It's more about political relationships. Economists, economic inquiry used to be called political economy, and this is a kind of political economy. Okay, following a German sociologist named Wolfgang Schreck, who has written, he was for a while the director at the Max Planck Institute in Germany. It's a very high prestige academic. If you have an appointment at Max Planck or you get to study there, you're top of your field. He came to the University of Wisconsin and taught there for about almost 10 years, and he's written extensively. And I'm borrowing from him. One of his most accessible books is called The End of Capitalism, and he goes through and does this analysis of various phases of capitalist development. So if we look, there's absolutely no question in my mind, and certainly I think in most economists' minds, that what got us out of the Great Depression was World War II. The WPA projects, progressive income tax, other kinds of things that we were talking about were working, but it was very slow. But once the war came out, then the mode of production was owned by the government. We had massive spending, and we'd spent so much and tooled up so much that at the end of the war, we really had to look at each other and say, what the heck are we going to do with all this industrial might? And we decided what we would do is build toasters and automobiles and other kinds of consumer items. According to Schreck, this period from 1945 to about 1970s, where we saw wages and productivity going up together, he calls managed or democratic capitalism. And it's characterized basically by high taxes, Progressive income tax is enforced. Progressive income tax is an amendment to the Constitution, but we don't really enforce it today. We have whole masses of legal firms and other experts who find ways for rich people to not pay taxes. It's a big issue. The rest of us don't have that privilege, but so we pay 20, sometimes up to 30% of our total income in taxes if you add sales taxes and income taxes. Okay, so high taxes, but the taxes were used to further the welfare state, the establishment of various kinds of Medicaid, Medicare, other sorts of things. Strong unions also characterized this period. The ducks got together, right? And government regulation. We had strong fiscal policy and Keynesian demand management, which was a shift in the way we began to think about what economy was. Richard Nixon, famously said in 1971, when we went off the gold standard, that we're all Keynesians now. And so we began to shift into a different kind of way. High growth, raising wages, fueled by productivity. And one of the most important factors, certainly for a lot of us in this room, is that we also had in this period from 1945 to 1970 an incredibly expanding middle class. And in fact, we didn't see anybody, any country do anything until the Chinese, beat us at that. They raised a middle class even faster than we did, but that's another story. What happens as we move out of managed democracy into another kind of capitalism? He calls that inflationary capitalism. And that's been in the period from the 1970s to the 1980s. And you can see the characteristics there. Government tried to sustain employment and social spending, but inflation redistributed, and we have a great deal of concern about inflation. The central bank is trying to deal with that. And the collapse was what we're basically talking about are the bubbles that began to burst. We've had people are talking now about a tech bubble. We already had a tech bubble burst in 2008, and people are talking about another one. There's also the possibility of an auto loan bubble, where people owe so much that they can't pay anymore, and then the cars lose their value, and you'll be able to go out in extreme circumstances, and buy a Genesis, for $25,000. Don't wait, but it could happen. Okay, so I'm going to hurry through this. The public debt capitalism is from the 1980s to the 1990s, and that's where we begin to we just basically transfer debt, to private companies and to interest groups and holding companies and such as that. There's private debt capitalism and consolidation austerity, and we've seen this in, Margaret Thatcher was famous for this, and we still have that kind of talk going on about how we have to cut back. What we're going through now, with efforts to lay off and cut federal spending as much as possible, is an austerity approach to capitalism. Now, these are the matters of moral concern that I think can't talk about all these, but these are matters of moral concern. Externalities, we haven't even touched on that. That's environmental damage. That's damage that companies do that they just pass off to other people. Pollution and so forth. Unemployment. Under the Keynesian model, we've been following this for several decades, and that is we cope with inflation by letting unemployment go up. That doesn't seem to be recognizing the dignity of every person, right? But that's the way we've been doing it for quite some time. Inequality of wealth. We live at a time that puts the Gilded Age to shame in the gap between the rich and the poor. Musk is getting close to having $1 trillion. I mean, again, whoa, what is that? And in the Gilded Age, we had approaches. We got the Sherman Antitrust Act to break up the robber barons, which is still around. Do we use it today? No. Right. Okay, so these are all more moral concerns. The new colonialism, which is another really interesting issue, and these are offshore banks. And offshore banks, they all are former British colonies. They're all governed by common law, and they all have within their provision ways of hiding money. And so we really don't even know how much money is hidden by rich people in offshore accounts. Fraud and corruption. This is kind of a survey of what Shriek thinks is happening to modern capitalism. These are the 5 systemic disorders, things that are going kind of crazy today. Stagnation, which we're seeing. Oligarchy, which is the very rich folks. We can sort of name them. Corruption, global anarchy, and the legitimation crisis. Global anarchy is when we bring in capitalism. One of the stories that I was so impressed, a guy did a dissertation when I was at Missouri State, and he came in and gave a presentation, and it was about folks living in West Africa. And typically, they live in compounds, and the families are around the chiefs, and the compound is surrounded by the commons. And the commons is not to be used unless somebody is really in trouble. And of course, the chief, who's a man, is in charge of this. And when some family gets in trouble, the chief could say, you may use the commons. And they'll go out in the commons and use it for whatever they want. And then when they recover, they can come back. Guess what happened? When market economies got into Africa, the younger men decided that the chiefs were stupid and they didn't see a good idea how to make money. So they began to convert the commons into crops so that they could take the crops to market. What happens? Those few guys do really well, and the rest of the village goes to pot, sometimes literally, right? So this is, I want to end with Shriek's thesis. He thinks that we're living in a post-capitalist interregnum, and he means by that we're just between the way capitalism operates. And democratic capitalism is not yet replaced, but he thinks that we're on the road to replacing it because we're not using the mechanisms of self-stabilization, which means we're not using the antitrust laws, we're not enforcing, we're not going higher taxes, and there's a likelihood that we wouldn't. Now, who knows? It's kind of pessimistic, but this is Shriek's position. And my point would be that as Unitarians, if we take our principles seriously, we have to be concerned, about these practices that are taking place in contemporary capitalism right under our noses. Thank you.
Our closing hymn is number 1017 in your teal hymnal. If you want to follow along with this one, we are building a new way. We've sung this one several times before, so if you'll rise as you're willing and able, we'll sing this together. Let's think about building those new ways, okay? We are building a new way. We are building a new way. We are building a new way, feeling stronger every day. We are building a new way. We are working
join me in extinguishing the chalice.
We extinguish this flame.
Thank you so much, Jeff. That was very thought-provoking. Yeah. Okay, thank you so much. Enjoy your beautiful Sunday.